Good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads. Today, episode 111, Friday, July 1st, 2022. Welcome to July. I think we're well into summer. Last week we had a great session with the Women Who Innovate continuing series with the Michigan Economic Development Corporation. This week we're back at it with our topic of de-risking. Why is de-risking a good term and a good process for the process of medical device development? And what's the vehicle for that process? Today we'll be talking all about that and the design control process as a vehicle for de-risking your medtech development efforts. Now, today, sadly, we won't have time for Q&A because this show is being pre-recorded. But if you have questions, please send them to info@intobeing.com. You can reach us through our web contact form at intobeing.com or through this email address. We'd be happy to answer any questions that come up during this show. And be sure to save the date. The Michigan Medical Device Summit, put together by MichBio, is happening September 20th, 2022 in Kalamazoo, Michigan. We're really looking forward to getting back to that in-person event, and that'll be happening in September. Well, that brings us to the main event. We're here talking about de-risking. Why is de-risking a good way to think about moving your product development forward? We'll be talking about it all through the month of July, and we're going to get really deep into some examples. But this week, it's all about design controls. Why are design controls a good vehicle for doing your de-risking? Now, last time, and you can scan that QR code there if you'd like to get to the YouTube channel to see last week's episode specifically. Last time, we talked about what is de-risking. We'll mention that again today. Why is de-risking a helpful mindset for medical device development? We're not just saying that de-risking should be applied as a part of medical device development, but de-risking should actually form a foundational framework. It should infuse everything we do. It should be how we move this ball forward. What stages of a project does it apply to? Hint, most of them. We told you a lesson from the woodshed, which we'll remind you of this week briefly. And then we went in depth onto GTD, getting things done. A very important framework. Now, the FDA doesn't mandate it or recommend it, but nevertheless, it's a way of identifying next actions that are available to you and your team. We also talked about the Cynefin framework, which is a sense-making framework, which allows you to understand whether you're in a domain where just pushing harder is the right solution, or whether you need to identify some critical unknown unknowns to be able to move forward. So if you have questions about these kinds of strategic elements, these philosophical elements, ways to think about the problems you're facing, scan that QR code and go back and watch last week's episode. But this week, it's all about design controls. It's all about how do we move forward? How do we put a structure around our development process to be able to move the ball forward? Well, first of all, why do you even need a vehicle? We'll be talking about that. Secondly, don't assume that you have a vehicle. A lot of people think to themselves, oh yeah, design controls, I've got that. When actually it's something very different than what they think it is. So we'll be talking about that today. We'll talk about what design controls actually are, diving into the Code of Federal Regulations. Grab the coffee for that one. And the important question of, will they slow me down? Do design controls slow a company down, or do they speed it up? Well, here's a hint. Depends largely on how they're implemented, and we'll be talking about that. How will they help? How does this abstract set of ideas implemented in my company actually make my life better? You kind of got to understand that if you're going to consider implementing them. Well, back to the top. What is de-risking? The OED defines it as making something safer by reducing the possibility that something bad will happen and that money will be lost. And like we said last week, that sounds like just about every medtech development project ever. They involve a lot of money, a lot of people, a lot of effort. And if we could reduce the chances that that is going to be lost, if we could increase the chances of success, we would be successful. Maybe you've seen some things that have happened to you. Maybe you've been involved in a bigger company with a competitive bid process for something. You had a project kickoff meeting. The team was excited, energized, charged. Role assignments were made. But then months pass. Nothing gets done, and the project falls behind schedule. If you've ever been party to something like this or watched it happen, you know that it's all too easy to have enthusiasm, but no plan. Or maybe you're an early stage company. We've been approached by many early stage companies, all the way back to the academic level, who will say this: I need a prototype. Okay. So that I can start clinical trials. Okay. So that I can submit to the FDA. Wait, hold on, there's something wrong about those things together. The right answer isn't, awesome, let's get going. It's to notice that there's something wrong with this picture. That cart and that horse are not quite lined up correctly. And so many times, people start with the best of intentions. They start with the money, they start with the enthusiasm, they start with the people. They don't understand how the pieces go together. Fundamentally, why do we say design controls is a good vehicle for medical device development? Because it allows you to get all those pieces in the right order. It allows you to understand what the cart is, what the horse is, and which direction they're all pointing. It's a natural vehicle for project planning. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't have other project planning techniques, just like you can have other problem-solving techniques. We talked about some of those last week. There are some really good fundamental philosophical ways to think about your problem domain. So I encourage you to do that. But FDA expects design controls to be applied to most medical device development projects. So if we can leverage that expected process and really see benefits out of it, we are well ahead of the game. Now, all of this still on the topic of de-risking. How do we get the risk out? One more word about de-risking. De-risking is infused, not applied. You don't just turn a crank and apply something and suddenly you've de-risked your project. De-risking through these tools, through these vehicles, needs to be infused into every part of your team's way of doing things. So it's very important not to smash the banana, but to do something more gentle with it so that it becomes a part of how you live and work as a team. We mentioned this last time, but a number of weeks ago, I was with some of my kids and we were doing a service project. And in that service project, one part of it was that we moved about 3 tons of wood in about 2 hours with a team of people. There are times in every project where things are clear, where it's time to simply pour on the effort, when it's time to just roll up your sleeves and get things done. It's really important not to lose sight of that. There are problems that can be solved by brute force, effort, time, money, and people. But that's not always the case, and in fact, it's rarely the case early and mid-stage during medtech development projects. So with that, why do I need a vehicle? Let's get into this topic of design controls. And we picked this picture mostly because it's a flashy car and some people like looking at cars. But that car right there isn't the best metaphor for design controls. And in fact, it represents either the best or the worst case, because some people will say, oh, I'm going to do design controls. I'm going to do it well. I'm going to build a vehicle like that. Well, hold on. That might not be the right solution. At the same time, many people who want to get things done will say, oh, don't bother me with those quality things. Don't bother me with those regulations. Don't bother me with all that extra paperwork. You're going to try to build me a race car, and I don't want a race car. I want the minimum necessary. And you know what? At some level, they're right. Because building parts of quality systems, including design control, that are flashy but purposeless, makes your life harder. It creates paperwork that has to be read, considered, and addressed. It's often been said that when you write procedures, you're writing your local law. Groups like the FDA don't always care exactly what you've written, but you better believe that if you wrote it, they're going to hold you to it. So, in fact, the race car isn't the best analogy for the type of vehicle that we're trying to build. In fact, if you want to haul something, and if this runs, this is probably better. It's a lot cheaper, I'll tell you that. Or maybe this. Maybe the smart car is a better analogy. Maybe you don't need to haul lumber in the back. Maybe you just need to get from point A to point B. In which case, you need only enough to get you there. These procedures need to be lean. They need it to be easily understood by everyone in the team. A word of caution. Many times people will say, oh, you need design controls. I have templates. Here's a stack of procedures. Well, guess what? If your whole team can't understand those and can't implement them, and you just have something in your filing cabinet, you don't really have design controls. That's not what we're talking about here today. Those kind of design controls won't accelerate you. They will slow you down. But suffice to say at this point, we need a vehicle. We need a way to get from point A to point B with whatever it is that we need to take with us. And that brings us to the first picture of the design control process, the classic waterfall picture. Now, we're going to talk more about the elements of this picture as we go through today's show, but right now I'm going to blank out a part of this. All the stuff in the middle, we're just going to take it away, and we're going to focus only on two parts: the user needs and the finished medical device. Your point A and your point B are those two. How do we get from the intended use and the user needs of your project to the finished medical device? That's what design controls is all about. It's all about going between those 2 points. So when we say that it's a vehicle to go between the intended use and user needs of your device all the way to that finished medical device. Now, it's true there's a lot of stuff in between, but I'll tell you this, most teams are not focused, believe it or not, on getting from that point A to that point B. They're focused on something different, and you can see it right at the center of this diagram. They're focused on what they like to call the design process, or maybe you've heard the term design thinking. And it's really popular, and it's really cool, and it's only a part of design controls. This is why when we hear people talk about design thinking, we think to ourselves, well, that's good, but that's not design controls. Design controls is a process that is much bigger than just how do I solve a given problem. So don't assume you have a vehicle. Many times people will say, well, I've got a regulatory consultant and they're ex-FDA. Surely they will teach me about design controls. Not so. We've seen many times that they don't actually know how to implement that. They may know how to prosecute applications with the FDA, but they haven't necessarily lived the developmental and engineering process that is design controls. Maybe you get a quality manager for your project. Well, many quality managers, good as they are, come from a post-market world. They've been working on maintaining quality for devices that have already been released to the market, not on how do you build new devices from scratch. Finally, a skilled engineering team is a wonderful asset, but many engineers are problem solvers, not project planners. And yet to be successful, you need to infuse de-risking thinking and design controls into your development team. So all of these individuals would be great to have on the team, but they don't necessarily bring with them thinking about design controls. So we want to teach you about design controls today. What are they? Well, they are defined in the Code of Federal Regulations, 21 CFR 820.30 to be specific. All of this is part of the Good Manufacturing Practices, otherwise known as GMP, which is part of the Quality System Regulation. If we zoom in just a bit, you can see on the left the entirety of GMP. There's different subparts, A through O. Now we're not going to touch all of these because only one is of interest to us today. And that is subpart C, or design controls, which we've zoomed in on the right side. Just next to it is document controls. Just above it is the quality system requirements like management responsibility, quality audits, personnel and training. Below it, purchasing controls. And then things that you would think of in a manufacturing context, like identification and traceability, production and process controls, acceptance activities, things that you expect to see on a shop floor in your local manufacturer. There's actually a priority to these, not in a post-market company. A post-market company has to worry about all of these, and all at the same time. So many times if a change happens to a product, you have to consider how it impacts all of these elements. But in a company that is pre-market, like those who are trying to develop and market new medical technologies, there's actually a priority or a sequence in which these subparts hit you and affect you. The good news is that means you don't have to think about it all at once. You can afford to develop your team, to teach them step by step. Hey, we're just going to bite off subpart C today. We're just going to do design controls. In a few months, we may be implementing something else. But right now, we can afford to roll out only this part of it. This leads to a bit of a hierarchy. We can do subpart C. Very quickly, we may need to do document controls, which is in subpart D. But many of the management aspects can wait just a minute while we're developing that product and while we're developing that company. Again, this doesn't apply to post-market companies that have their product on the market. This only applies to new startups that haven't developed their quality system yet. They can afford to phase its development. And ultimately, as you approach that market clearance, it is time to think about the rest of the quality system, but it can be done in a stepwise fashion. So I encourage you to think about this. And if you've ever been approached by somebody who wants to drop an entire quality system on your small little startup, be very wary. Ask them if they can do it in a phased manner. And ask them which parts of it matter first. I think you'll find that design controls is the first one that hits for many developmental stage startups. Well, does this apply to all medical devices? That's a great question. Design controls, according to 820.30, apply to a few different situations. They apply to all Class 3 devices. That's a given. They apply to all Class 2 devices. Now, there may be places where exceptions can occur, but that's exceptionally rare. In general, they apply to Class 1 devices that are automated by computer software. So if you have automation using computer software in your device, even though you're a Class 1 device, you may not be subject to 510K. But if you are automated by computer software, you will be subject to design controls. There's also 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 specific categories of Class 1 device that are subject to design controls. It's a very eclectic list. A tracheobronchial suction catheter, which happens to be Class 1 but subject to design controls. A surgeon's glove, which is Class 1 but subject to design controls. A protective restraint, again Class 1 but subject to design controls. A manual radionuclide applicator system, and teletherapy, a radionuclide teletherapy source. Those list of 5 things, as well as Class 1 devices automated by software, are subject to design controls, as well as Class 2 and Class 3 devices. So great news if you're a Class 1 device without software, there's a really good chance that you're not subject to design controls and you can skip the rest of this video. But if you're any one of these other categories, this video applies to you. Now, we're going to be making some summaries in the upcoming slides. These summaries do not replace going back and reading 820.30. The way that we've summarized it may miss a small nuance. The goal here is to make sure that you understand the overarching points of this design control regulation. So go read 21 CFR 820.30 for more information. But as you get into 21 CFR 820.30, the first section, design and development planning, which starts by this: establish and maintain plans. You're going to see those kind of words frequently. Establish and maintain. What does that mean? It means that in general, it's going to have to be a written document or procedure. It's going to have oversight that somebody signed off and said, this is what we're doing as a company. And the maintenance of it is showing by objective, read written evidence, that this plan or these procedures are being used. What do things like that look like? Well, they look like outputs. They look like outputs of review meetings. They look like reports that have been analysis of the content of your system. There's things that you can point to say, look, we're not only having this system, but we are running this system. So establish and maintain, an important principle in working with the FDA. Establish and maintain plans for design and development activities. Right there, you ought to be able to see that what Company A and Company B need to do could be wildly different. This is why saying, do you have a template for design and development planning? Can only be the most basic template, because beyond the most basic elements, design and development planning is going to be unique to your company and actually specifically your product. That's why most companies have a design and development planning procedure, but then a design and development planning phase where they say, for this product, this is what we're going to do. These plans need to list responsibilities. Who are the responsible parties? Now, they don't all necessarily have to be internal to your company. You can assign responsibilities outside, but you do have to have responsibilities established as a part of these plans. Listing sources of design inputs. This is an important part of planning. You know, the engineering team isn't usually the best group of people to say what the product should do. They're the best ones to make the product to do it. But your marketing department, your external stakeholders, your thought leaders, these are the sources of good inputs. And you should plan up front where these are coming from. Who truly has a voice into the product and who doesn't? Finally, these plans need to be reviewed, updated, and approved. There needs to be a demonstration of oversight. Next up in design controls, design input. We showed a plug there because this is where everything's coming into the process. This is where the power for the process is coming in. This is what enlivens your whole development process. There you see those words again. Establish and maintain procedures. You need a procedure for how you do design inputs. You need to ensure that the requirements for your device are appropriate. What does that mean? Well, different things for different companies. What does it mean for your company to ensure that your input requirements are appropriate? You may want to talk with your engineering team to make sure that they think they can meet them and that they are addressable. You may want to talk with your marketing department to find out if they believe that this is what the customer is really asking for. You may want to talk with clinicians, as we have on this show before, to find out if what you're thinking to do actually jives with how they run their practices. So you need to have a procedure for how do you check this? How do we know that our input requirements are good? You better make sure that they address the intended use and the user needs of the device, and that you can resolve incomplete, ambiguous, or conflicting requirements. As your documentation grows, so can the ambiguities, so can the conflicts. If two things get written down and they sort of in tension with each other, there better be a way to resolve those. Usually it's a hierarchy. There are documents that have precedence over other documents, so that if something's not quite right, you can say this one overrules this one. Makes it easier to focus on what matters. Finally, you got to be able to ensure that the requirements are documented, that the requirements are reviewed and approved by a designated individual with a date and with a signature. That's design inputs. Now, if you think that's not a whole lot, that doesn't look too hard, you're right. The paragraph that this section came out of isn't much longer than the slide that I'm showing you right now. We just broke it up to make it a little bit easier to understand. The entire section of design controls at 21 CFR 820.30, you can read it in probably less than 10 minutes. Now, that doesn't mean that you instantly know what to do or that you instantly understand the implementation of design controls. But this is not hard stuff. And as we talk about why this vehicle is useful, hopefully you can see that if you don't do these sorts of things, you have a process that's actually relatively out of control. You're not going to find here any kinds of weird, esoteric, then you have to do this, then you have to do this, and since we're the FDA, we require that you purchase this software over here. You're not going to find any of that in the design control procedure. In fact, it's all very simple, basic, rational things that they're asking a team to do and implement in process. None of these things that they're asking are outside of what you would want to do to make sure that you have control over your process. And this can be extremely, extremely simple. Many teams that we work with will say, oh, we need to have everybody sign off. Well, that's not true. There has to be at least a designated individual to sign off. Now, you may want more people to sign off, but you don't have to overburden this. This can be very, very simple. And into being, when we implement this with companies, it's not a whole lot of pages of text to implement the whole of a design control procedure. Well, design outputs. This is everyone's favorite part, to be honest. It's what most companies have already started on without knowing it by the time anyone ever talks to them, because they're so interested in coming up with solutions. They want to come up with solutions. And design outputs are those solutions. It's what the device actually is, not what it should do. And so as we think about design outputs, the FDA says, once again, establish and maintain procedures for defining and documenting design output. How will design output be defined? How will it be documented? Now, if you're a software company, that's going to look different than if you're an electronics company. Or if you make plastics rather than sheet metal, how that gets defined adequately will be very, very different. But nevertheless, it's up to your company to define what is expected, what makes a good design output. Maybe it's CAD files, maybe it's detailed tolerance drawings, maybe it's code documented in a certain way. Whatever it is, there need to be procedures that define how you do that for your company. It really needs to be in testable terms. Now, the language is not quite that in 820.30, but that's a really good summary of what they're going for. You need to be able to take your output and be able to look at it against your inputs. That's the process of verification. And so it's important to understand how that's going to be documented and defined as a part of your design output procedure. You need acceptance criteria. If you say, here's my part, I want it to look like this, that's not enough. The question is, within what dimensional framework for physical parts is that going to be true? There has to be acceptance criteria. This is an overlooked part of the process. Too many people will say, I want the part to be this size, but they can't give a range, a go, no-go range, where if it's bigger than this, it's bad, and if it's smaller than that, it's bad, but in between, it's good. And FDA recognizes this and says, if you don't have that as a part of your design outputs, you don't really have your design outputs complete. Again, we've seen so many times where a company races ahead and they say, we gotta order these parts, but they don't define something as basic as the acceptance criteria by which finished parts are going to be judged. They don't actually have design outputs. The parts that get made are wrong. They just wasted 12 weeks. Now they have to back it up, and they're wondering, why did it take so long? This isn't really esoteric stuff. This is very, very basic stuff. FDA recognizes it and asks for it in design outputs. You also need to identify function-critical outputs. What outputs need to be paid attention to, and what outputs, well, as long as they're sort of there, they're going to work. It's a very important part as well. They have to be documented. They have to be reviewed and approved before release. You can't go sending things out and say, oh, we'll worry about it later. With a date and a signature. That's design outputs. One of the things that we've found in our own practice is that even if you're in the sandbox, when something goes out to a third party, it makes sense to be following these design output procedures, because then your design will be under control at some level. You can go back and reference it. It's never a good idea to say, oh yeah, that's in my email somewhere. So if you're looking for a rule of thumb, starting to implement some design output techniques, even if you don't have written procedures, by the time you're starting to send some things out to third parties for review, for quote, it's a really good principle. Well, after that, the FDA talks about design review. What does design review have to be? How complex and formal does it have to be? What sorts of experts do I need to have? Who do I need to hire to have a good design review? No, all of that's not the point. The point of design review is once again to establish and maintain procedures to have formal, documented reviews. This is a point to put responsible parties on the spot and make sure that they're willing to say, yes, what we've done to date is good enough, and we're going to move this forward. It's a point where everybody really needs to be on the same page. Now, these are done at appropriate stages. If I had a nickel for every company out there that has a plan for how they execute design stages, I'd be a very rich man. But the reality is that FDA doesn't say that there are 5 stages or 6 stages or 3 stages to the medical device design process. If you look on the web, you'll find all sorts of people saying the 5 stages of medical device development. And that's great if they have a process that works for them and works for their clients. But the reality is that all that FDA says is appropriate stages. Do you sense the freedom in that statement? There might only be 1 stage. There might be 12. It's really up to your company and what's going to help you to implement these principles. Now, you do need, for these reviews, function representatives. That is, if you have a head of software and you have a head of electronics and you have a head of mechanical design and you have a clinical lead, et cetera, and you're asking the team to approve something that affects all those areas, you better be sure to have all those people in the room, or at least some representatives for them, because it would be unfair to move ahead with a project without their buy-in. There's a good chance that it would get sunk later when they finally reviewed what had been supposedly approved. So having function representatives as a part of your reviews, your formal reviews, is very important. The FDA also has a requirement for an independent reviewer. Just because you can get into groupthink, you can get into silos. So they say there has to be somebody there who, regardless of their other responsibilities, doesn't own and hasn't really worked on any of the content of that review. So it might be somebody from inside your company, it might be somebody outside your company, but nevertheless, an independent reviewer is an important part of the design review process. Any specialists who are necessary to the topics? This all needs to be documented in the design history file, along with the results of the review. There may be changes that need to be made. There may be updates that need to be made. Those results need to be documented. Identification of what was being reviewed, critically important. It's no good to say we reviewed the product if you don't have documentation of what the product was. So to be clear on what was reviewed is absolutely critical. Finally, the date, the individuals who are present. You'll note there that there wasn't a signature requirement for the design reviews, but simply the presence. Next up, design verification. Establish and maintain procedures for verifying the device design. We'll talk more about this in a minute. We've got some cool graphics to show you to help with this. But the device design does need to be verified to confirm that the output meets the inputs. This all gets documented in the design history file, including identification of the design, the methods used to do verification, the date, the individuals performing the verification, and that's design verification. If you're surprised at how simple that is, don't be. There's a lot that goes in under the hood there. There are best practices, there are standards, there are third-party test houses, there's guidances for writing test methodologies. We're not saying this is all that there is to medical device verification testing. But the reality is that from a procedural standpoint, when you perform that testing, it needs to be done under control. It needs to confirm that the outputs meet the inputs, not that you checked something interesting to you, but you showed this linkage between these two topics. And who did it, what date it was done, and what protocol that they used are all critical things to record. Why are they critical? Well, if you don't have those, the reality is you're not going to have the information to say that we tested this device. So you think you're doing work, but you actually weren't doing productive work. This is why design controls can be a vehicle. Because if you have these things in front of you and you're doing these things, you're more likely to get from point A to point B. If you just go, quote, do testing, you won't necessarily end up with the right things. And so many times we've seen that companies have to repeat their testing, which can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and can cost months off of their timeline. Design validation, finally. Establish and maintain procedures, no surprise there. For validating the device design under defined conditions. Now, FDA doesn't specify what those defined conditions are, but they do give us some clarity in just a minute. Validation, and this is an often missed point, needs to be done on initial production units or their functional equivalents. That means that if you're an early stage startup and you made something on your bench and you did a 2-year clinical trial on it, chances are that unless you can show that what you built on your bench is production representative, that clinical trial isn't going to count. And this is a blind spot for many, many, many teams. If you want to count it as validation, they need to be initial production or equivalent. Even if they weren't initial production, if you can demonstrate that what was in them was identical to what you're going to be producing, then you could still salvage it. You have to check conformity to user needs and intended uses. That's the whole point of validation. Validation from the regulatory perspective isn't gathering data so that you can write a better paper. It's about showing that the user needs and intended uses of the device have been met. And sometimes that can be simpler than people think. Sometimes there are products that have only one user need. And the validation of those is very, very simple, and it's the use of a simulator by a trained user. Other times it can be more complex and involve clinical trials. But the reality is that validation isn't the same thing as academic research. It's something for a specific purpose to demonstrate conformity to user needs and intended uses. It can be actual or simulated use, like we just said. And software validation and risk analysis, if appropriate, come to bear here. They have to be part of it. All of this needs to be documented in the design history file. the results themselves, identification of the design, the methods used, the date, and the individuals who are performing the validation. Because of time, we won't go through the last three things, but also the design transfer process is a part of design controls. Are you sure that your design has been translated into production specifications? The fact that you can make it on a bench doesn't mean that your manufacturer can, and if we haven't gotten to that point, we haven't completed design controls. Design changes are a part of the design control process. How do I deal with changes? What do I have to go back and revisit? What needs to be done? What can happen with parts that may have already been created? Can they be kept, or do they have to be discarded? This is all the stuff of design change. And the design history file itself, what goes in it, and what is it all about? These are all parts of design control. But this brings us to an important question. Will design controls slow me down? The minute we talk about anything that's regulatory related or documentation related, people can say, I don't want to do that, it's going to slow me down, I need time in the sandbox. Well, that's great. We love the sandbox, especially in the summertime, as much as anybody else. This from the FDA's QSIT, or Quality System Inspection Technique. FDA says this, to their inspectors who are going to come and check whether you're doing things right. They say that the firm's development of concepts and the conduct of feasibility studies are not subject to the design control requirements of the regulation. In other words, if somebody walks through your door and says, oh, you've done work as a design company, you should be under design controls. Show them this paragraph. It's simply not true. You have a lot of freedom to play in the sandbox effectively as long as you want to. Now, if you stay there, you'll never get a product on the market. But you have a lot of freedom to play up until you are ready for a very important point. It says that once the firms that a design will be developed, a design plan must be established. However, design controls must be applied no later than the time the firm approves its first set of inputs. Now, if we look at this in a linear fashion, we'll come back to this waterfall. And waterfalls are pretty linear things, but real life isn't. So even though in this picture we can see design inputs happen early in the process and design outputs happen later in the process, the reality is that most teams discover that they're making changes to design inputs all the way up until they're nearly done with the outputs. What does this lead to? Well, in an absolutely strict stage gate process, which if you'll recall, the FDA never requires, people establish gates, 3, 4, 5, 6 gates, the 6 steps to medical device development. But the reality is that you have the freedom to set stage gate reviews at appropriate places. The fact that there are lines drawn in this graphic does not imply that the FDA mandates that there must be reviews at these points. This leads to some very interesting realizations. In the absolutely leanest concept that can be conceived of, and your situation may be more complex, but it's important to realize how lean it can go. If we start with design inputs relative to the user needs and intended use of a system, chances are our company is probably working on design outputs simultaneously. Now, are they formalized? Are they fully documented? Are they reviewed yet? No, of course not. We're playing with ideas. But in this sandbox, design outputs and design inputs, if we're doing this right, are in fact maturing under a low burden, low stress, low documentation framework. But while those are maturing, we eventually come to a point, and that's the point where we start to say, we really need to start building things for our verification and validation. And that is a point of no return. Because like we said before, if you're going to do verification and validation, there's certain requirements about what it was you were testing and what you knew about it. This drives us to at least one absolutely critical stage gate review. And that could be a stage gate review that deals with both inputs and outputs. Because from there, you need to build the things under control that are going to be used for your verification and validation. Now, that doesn't mean you couldn't have been doing verification all the way through this process. In fact, there's a lot of verification you can do, and it doesn't require production representative parts. But for validation, it does. And so we've often found that this trigger of saying, I want to build parts for testing, tends to bring us close to a trigger for the first stage gate review. Now, you could have had more before that. You're welcome to have more before that. If it's helpful, you certainly can. But here's where the rubber really meets the road. When it's time to do builds for verification and validation. And certainly there's going to be a review pre-market. Your company needs to review and hold a sign-off that what you've done is adequate. There's also another meaning to the term pre-market review, and that's the FDA's review of your clearance. So we're sort of using that term to do double duty in this graphic. And the reality is that you're going to submit the results of your verification and validation to the FDA for pre-market review. So wherever your internal review happens, this is another fixed point in the process. And so from this perspective, there's at least two major reviews that probably need to happen in almost any context. But that doesn't mean that you necessarily need tons more. And so I'd encourage you to think in this lean manner. And if somebody says, we're going to go through 10 review stages, you are right in asking the question, do I have to? What benefit is this going to bring? And specifically, does FDA require it? The answer to the latter, most likely no, from what we've seen. It's also important to realize that you can go back, and sometimes you have to. That may trigger new reviews. Because if you discover something later in the process, even post-market, that changes something about your design, you will have to go back and revisit these phases and probably have some form of a review to sign off that the changes didn't affect too much. Well, how do design controls help? I think you've already gotten a sense of that from what we've talked about today. But I want to show you one more graphic. And this one shows the process starting with the intended use of the device. From the intended use of the device, we're able to consider the needs of the user and the patient. Very important input. We're also able to consider the risks associated with the device. We're also able to consider the product codes that the intended use drives. And from the product codes, what standards are relevant to our product development effort. Now, if you simply set out and said, let's go design something, and you didn't consider the needs of the user, the risks and mitigations associated with the device, and the standards that you need to follow, how would you ever design a device that was going to meet the inputs? You simply can't do it. So in this sense, not belaboring these points, but at least addressing them allows you to know what your device has to do. If you don't have it and you're just doing it by the seat of your pants, there's almost no way that you will design a device that meets what you're trying to do. From there, design input requirements that are actually technical requirements can be developed. And as you move into later product development, you now have a framework to manage and plan things like verification and things like validation. That's how design controls help. In a nutshell here, again, we're looking at the design control process. It's very simple, it's very basic, but without it in place, the team as a whole doesn't actually know where it's going. The fact that FDA requires it makes it that much more important. Well, that's our discussion of design controls as a vehicle for medical device de-risking. Have this plan, have it lean, have it in front of your entire team so that they understand the benefit of it and so that they can navigate what's ahead of you. We wish you all the best in your efforts. Next week, we will continue the series, getting into more specific examples of where de-risking applies and some specific techniques and case studies that enable that. I want to thank the website unsplash.com for a lot of the picture credits that we used today. You can scan those barcodes to take you right to some of the pictures that we used. It's a free service. They ask only that you give credit, and so credit where credit is due for some of the cool pictures, and these last two as well. But with that, we can't wait to see you next week on MedTech Crossroads as we continue this series on de-risking medical device development. We'll get specifically into case studies and applications of the principles we've been talking about for the first 2 weeks. Thanks for being with us, and have a great day.